welcome to another reignited episode of Fire in My Belly, an art podcast. I think I am your host and also someone with a horse named after them, Cat Grapham. Today's episode is a lovely conversation with my friend and extremely talented illustrator, Helvetica Blanc. We met in 2019 at the Small Press Expo, and I have been a huge fan of her work ever since. Her pieces are incredibly rich in texture, truly fascinating in their iconography, and they are expertly well composed. In this conversation, we talk about losing your faith, permacomputing, Icelandic witchcraft, corporate Memphis art style, tons of other stuff. I thought our conversation was a hoot, and I hope you all enjoy it. If you would like to see the video version of this podcast, where you can see both of our lovely faces as well as all of the things that we talk about shown on screen, you can do so exclusively over on my Patreon, patreon.com/catgrapham. I am posting the video version every single month, and patrons get an additional 2 to 4 week exclusive access to the episode entirely. Another way you can support the episode is by following it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and giving it a rate and review. That really helps in the algorithm and helps people discover the podcast. That is also a really helpful way to let me know what you guys think. All right, let's get into the conversation. So let's start with you introducing yourself.
I am Helvetica Blanc, and I am a digital artist, mostly making zines and currently working on an Oracle card deck.
This wasn't in my list of questions, but I realized that I don't actually know how you decided on the name of Helvetica Blanc.
Yeah, because it's not like my name that I use.
No, but it would be a really
art.
good name. Helvetica would be a great first name.
No, I thought for a long time, and part of it is it's like a probably one of my favorite fonts. Being a graphic designer for fucking ages. Are we allowed to say fuck?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Just making sure. Being a graphic designer for ages, obviously everyone loves Helvetica. So, well, I guess there are people that hate it. So I'm not.
Helvetica is a great font.
Yeah, it's a fantastic font. It's a workhorse. So yeah, that kind of has just stuck with me for a long time. And then I started using it as kind of like my name for like magical purposes, like for spiritual purposes.
Okay.
Like a witch's coven name kind of thing. I was just
Sure.
Helvetica. And then Blanc was just a fun play on my last name, which is Black. So I thought, something that sounded similar but meant the opposite.
I was about to say, yeah, that's like the inverse.
Yeah, like a nice little alliteration there. And it was just kind of hit me one day. I was ready to start a new style to work on, and just kind of woke up one day. I was like, Helvetica Blanc. That's a good name. I should use that. And then,
has anyone ever thought that your name was Helvetica?
I mean, I pretty much use it for anything having to do with like the artistic persona, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, I'm sure there are some folks who know my actual name. I think you're among them.
But is somebody like emailed you and been like, hello, Helvetica?
Oh, absolutely. And I respond to everything as like HB. So
I love that. That's great.
I
think it should just be your name at this point.
Gonna go change my name again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, why wouldn't you? You can change your name unlimited amount of times.
Believe me, yeah, been there.
So how did you arrive at becoming? You kind of alluded that you kind of started your career in graphic design. How did you arrive at graphic design?
So when I was a kid, I wanted to be an artist. I think this is like super common, right? Like when you want to be when you grow up, it's like I'd like to do painting or whatever. And I just never got, or I always ended up taking like technical courses instead of artistic courses. So like I would learn about working in a like a woodworking shop or something like that in high school. They were doing electronics and things like that. And part of that was they had Photoshop and Illustrator. So I had very early access to versions of that back in the mid 90s. Um,
Oh, okay.
early versions.
Hmm.
And then almost immediately out of high school, I started working in short run print shops, like, what would be just a copy shop. But I was doing like the really, really rudimentary graphic design stuff then. And this was before, I mean, this was still doing cut and paste at the time. It was not even on the computer for some stuff. It was right at
Like
the
literal cut and paste.
like literally cutting out, like the article or whatever for someone's
Hmm.
like, flyer, and then pasting it like with rubber cement, and then putting it on like, a light box so that they can get it and all that fun stuff. And it was like in that strange transitional period where like desktop publishing was becoming a thing. So we had, oh gosh, it was like Microsoft PageMaker or something like that.
Hmm.
And there was Quark Express and stuff, which I think is still around. But I'm no longer using that.
Yeah, I've never heard of Quark Express, so I imagine that probably not a lot of people are
I think
using
it's
it
still
right
being used
now.
in newspapers, if I'm
Oh,
not
oh,
mistaken.
okay.
You want to talk about like, holding on to like the last vestiges of a program for a dying industry.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, yeah. So I was kind of right there at that transitional point between like the really very like lo-fi traditional way of doing copies and press work and stuff like that to like digital. And I just kind of stuck with it. Like I ended up going to school for other stuff to be a minister. And then
Oh, okay. I Now that you say that, I do remember this, that you've told me this before. That's so crazy.
yeah, there's a fun story there, right? But so and after school, I almost immediately just jumped right back into doing graphic design, and I ended up doing it for commercially for about 15 years total.
What got you out of graphic design?
Oh, the pandemic, honestly.
Oh, okay.
It was a chance for me to reevaluate what I really wanted to do. When we're all kind of living in this like apocalyptic feeling time where we're like, well, shit, why am I doing this thing that I am good at, but I don't really enjoy versus something that I really wish I could do? And I got very lucky. I have a supportive partner who helps buoy for the bills and all that stuff. Um,
I think a lot
yeah.
of artists have
Yeah, we're
that.
all like, we all have supportive partners. It's fantastic. They're all like, yeah, we'll fund your escapades.
Yeah, while they're working a brutal 9 to 5 or something.
Right, exactly.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Did you find, especially, I feel like during the pandemic, such a volatile time, obviously, did you find that change challenging or nerve-wracking, or did it just happen naturally, like you already sort of had a built-in audience and clients and things like that?
Well, for me, it was kind of starting fresh. I had a few clients, people who were interested, who had commissioned me for stuff because I was doing a little more illustration on the side at the time, but not in like a really defined style. It was just kind of like whatever the client needed, I could emulate pretty decently.
Hmm.
And I was still trying to find my own voice. And it was kind of the right around the summer of 2020 that it kind of just worked. Suddenly, I was making work that like felt right, and it was like this just big creative explosion.
Yeah, you
And
make a lot of stuff. You're very, very productive.
yeah,
It makes me feel bad about myself.
please
So
don't, please don't. For no, it's really ritualized. Like I'm like two pieces a week, and then I've got like a schedule for time blocked out for sketches and work for cards and clients and things like that. It's all extremely ritualized for me in a way
yeah,
that like,
not in a free spirited sort of
yeah,
like,
I don't wake up going, oh, what am I gonna do today? Maybe I'll draw. No, I'm like, okay, so like Mondays are like these two things, Tuesdays are this, Wednesdays are this, etc.
do you
Um,
think that's necessary to be self-employed and to freelance, to have that regimented self-discipline?
I would say absolutely, but and, I mean absolutely for me.
Hmm.
I have to be, otherwise I just won't. I'll play video games all day. Like I would love to just like kick around, but like once I get in like the work mode, then it's like, okay, I do this for this set amount of time, and it's been really good for me. It doesn't work for everybody, but
I've personally struggled with trying to keep any sort of semblance of a schedule. I'm just like, I feel like I work either, it's either all or nothing for me, I think.
right,
Like
right.
I'm either working not at all or 12 hours a day. Like there's no real in
And
between.
see, that's the other half, right? Is you have to know when to say like that's it for the day.
Yeah. When your work is also your passion, it's really easy
It's
to,
so easy.
and even if it's not existing, like you're not actively working, I feel like my brain can't dissociate from like work brain of like thinking about it and it consuming also my thoughts, which feels like work because it's like
Yeah. So you're a
time
hyper
thinking.
focused person as well.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Either hyper focusing or nothing, like
Right.
no in between.
Right. Yeah.
0 or 100, which is
Yeah.
very healthy. So I know you grew up in the South, and I think you were living in the South when we met in 2019 at the Small Press Expo.
Yes.
How do you think the Southern environment and culture or mindset influence the content of your work now?
Oh my God. It's in a way it's the whole thing. Because largely my work is an exploration of my own subconscious, trying to, dredge up stuff. And a big part of that is working through my own religious trauma. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a deeply Southern Baptist church. Uh, and I was very much a true believer up until my early mid 20s. I was deep in it. Like I said before, I went to school for ministry, so
Yeah,
that was
you
a
were
big.
in it,
I
in
was
it, in it.
truly in it. I was ready to become a minister. And yeah, eventually the questions just stacked up too high, and I started deconstructing everything. A lot of the stuff, looking back, a lot of stuff, like I was born in the early 80s. So I was living in the South in these religious circles during the Satanic Panic, right? Which we're kind of seeing this like wild resurgence of, especially with regard to like queer
Mm-hmm.
folks, right? Like there's this whole like they're groomers, they're awful, all these awful things, right? And it's like we've heard all this before. This is just lifted from the scripts from the 80s that talked about gay people instead of trans people.
Yeah,
um
it's like the AIDS conversation, and
yeah, they barely did a copy paste on it,
yeah.
like. So being raised in that environment, like it left me with a lot of conflict around being queer, which is something I suppressed for a very long time. And it also left me with like just a lot of baggage around my relationship to Christianity, my relationship to the church, my relationship to spirituality in general. My work, a lot of it is kind of unpacking that in a way.
Mm-hmm.
I went through, after leaving the church and kind of, losing my faith. I went through like a whole bunch of like exploration and stuff like that. And for a while landed on chaos magic. So talking about like making sigils and stuff, and that really appealed to me as a graphic designer. I was like, oh, this is something I'm good at. So, and that was one of my first early brushes with kind of like, okay, this there might be something to this, as far as like finding a way to kind of connect a new reconstructed spirituality, however that may look, with my own artistic inclinations.
Did you do any sort of spiritual based work, personal work before sort of like quote unquote losing your faith? Or was that part of your like journey into finding new ways to like new avenues for your
Yeah,
own
I
spirituality?
didn't do back when I was like in the church and stuff. I did very very little work, like artistic work around that, because I mean, as you may know, like a lot of visual art is very discouraged in these circles. Like,
Yeah, you can tell from their websites.
yeah, I mean, like Yeah,
Mhm.
exactly. I mean, there's just like, I think someone rightfully said it's just a descendant of the iconoclastic controversy, right? Which is like, all the, when Martin Luther showed up and is like, we're going to reform the church, and all the Protestants were like, yeah, fuck it up. And they, took down the statues and all these things that made them think of paganism or of idol worship and stuff like that. So there's like this very strong undertone. I mean, like, and that's not to say that any one church or denomination is like super like we don't like visual art, because people in general are drawn to visual art, but there's this kind of undercurrent of, well, we'd rather you put your artistic talents into something like music, which is why a lot of these, like, which is why the college that I went to, uh for ministry, they had a massive, well-funded music program that was incredible. I mean, some of
I
the
mean,
best
music is so
musicians.
seductive with with
it
religion as
grabs the
well.
emotions, right? Like
Yeah.
in such an immediate way, and like, at least in their context, like makes you feel like you're being connected to something
Hmm.
something greater. Art is a lot more opaque, like you have to sit with a piece in silence almost, to like really like connect with it. And then it's not, they're not telling you what it means. They're not telling you, this is, I mean, it's Thomas Kincaid or something, right? It's
It
not
promotes
telling you
free
what
thought,
yeah, it promotes this idea
interpretation.
of like you're making this own, you have to draw your own conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's probably goes hand in hand with why they've historically been so controlling about how visual art
Oh,
has
absolutely.
looked for
Absolutely. Oh,
hundreds of
it's also
years.
like just one or two steps from, idolatry, right? Like it's hard to make an idol out of music. Well, maybe not, but it feels like it's a more challenging thing. But like if you make a painting of Jesus, it's like, oh well, you've got now you have this image that you could worship instead of
Hmm.
something else.
And he's white and blonde and has
Yeah, just
blue eyes.
mysteriously Scandinavian.
Hmm. Speaking of Scandinavia, I wanted to talk about like this symbolism and the the way that you work in different like mystical characters or iconography. And I was wondering if those are specifically like drawn from things that exist already and you're kind of interpreting them
Mm.
and reconstructing them, or are they part of your own like internal universe? Because I feel like sometimes I see like sort of like some Nordic inspiration in your work
Totally,
as well,
totally.
like Icelandic witchcraft and things like that.
I would say that Icelandic folk magic was a big visual inspiration for me back when I was just beginning to make sigils back in 2015 or so. And
Have you
it's
been to Iceland?
I have not. I have not. My family is from Sweden, largely from
Oh,
England.
cool.
So there's my one small bit of connection. I don't really have much cultural connection to it, though. I'm
Hmm.
very thoroughly Americanized in that
I went
regard.
to the Icelandic Witchcraft Museum in Iceland. And it
Oh,
was,
whoa.
yeah, it was really weird, but it was, I mean, like in a great way, like
Yeah, yeah.
bizarre. But it was so neat. And it just, that whole place, not to like, you know, mythologize a place that actually exists with real people, but like it
Right.
really does kind of feel like you're on a different planet there because of the like geographical absurdity of
Oh,
a
yeah. Well, and they're
volcano and sulfur pits and like this beautiful coastline. It's just like nothing
well, and they're so
earth.
isolated culturally from the rest of
Yeah.
even Scandinavia, because like went out there, and like if you look at the folk magic that they have, it's so specific.
Yeah. And like magical skin pants. Like,
Necropants, yes.
yeah, they had like a recreation of skin pants at
Wait, they
the museum.
didn't have
And
the
you're
real
supposed to
thing?
like, uh, it like looked real. I'm pretty sure it wasn't real. And then it was a recreation and not some sort of like taxidermy situation. But I think the idea was that you wore you made skin pants out of a dead person that like stole from you, and then you would like shit out money basically. wearing
I think
those
it was that
pants?
that you could always reach into the pants and find gold.
Yeah, some sort of, yeah, there would be
Some
gold in the
yeah,
pants or
like
some sort of
it's
weird
a way
thing.
to get money. Like,
Hmm.
and I guess like as long as you wear these pants, you'll never be out of money. Which
Yeah, the skin of somebody else. Perfectly,
yeah,
very
all you
Ed
need is
Gein.
some other guy's skin. No big deal, right?
Hmm. But yeah, is are the symbols that you incorporate directly drawn from that sort of inspiration, or is there a combination of your own stuff plus that?
It's a little of a both. Okay, so that was a visual influence for me. So I was like looking at like how they did angles and like intersections and things like that. It was a very kind of like design oriented thing. But the probably the biggest influence on my sigil work is from Austin Osman Spare, who is a mystic, occultist. He was briefly associated with Crowley, and he's kind of his work, his art, and his sigils were kind of the foundation for what would become chaos magic in like the 60s and 70s. And what he did, his method was taking the English alphabet, and you'd write your intent or whatever for the sigil to be, and
Hmm.
you'd combine letters, and it basically create design, little sigil out of these letter forms. So that was kind of a good starting point. And I was also referencing this is back when I was doing everyday sigils on Tumblr. So this is back in like 2015 or so. I was
The
kind
good
of
Tumblr days.
yeah, the good Tumblr days. I was referencing like primarily Spare's work along with like VCR instructions,
Okay.
like the very like schematic electronic schematics and stuff like that. I thought those were absolutely interesting, and it kind of felt like this is like magic as schematic, right? I thought that was kind of an interesting thing. It's just continued to evolve since then, like I like looking at like Icelandic folk magic as one small influence amongst like a bunch of other stuff.
Hmm.
And yeah, so like I've definitely, like, as I've studied symbols for a long time at this point, very much made an active effort to not include symbols that are like deeply important to like other people's
Hmm.
cultures, because they're not my cultures.
I
Like,
think that's the right move.
yeah, like I don't have any connection to like indigenous cultures, or
Hmm.
to Celtic cultures even, or to various East Asian like cultures, right? Like, I don't have any connection to this, so I am left to kind of forge ahead on my own with what is meaningful to me.
I also wanted to know, what is your starting point for making your images, because they're very geometric, but
Mm.
they feel like something simple extrapolated on, and it's very, the layouts are very incredibly well composed. What's your starting point, and like how do you come up with an image? Do you have a set idea in mind, or does it kind of just take its own shape as it comes along?
It's interesting because this has kind of changed slowly over the course of my career so far. So like at the very beginning, it was purely just automatic. If you're familiar with automatic drawing or whatnot, where
Yes.
you kind of
Yeah.
zone out, meditate, whatever, and just kind of look.
Quite a religious tie too, I would
Oh, I
say.
mean, my whole work is still a very spiritual practice. It's
Hmm.
just in the service of making art itself. Art. I mean, I often say that it's art as magic, magic as art. Like, it's all the same for me. I light my candles, I do my incense and all that stuff. I pray to Eris, all the good stuff. And
While before you make art, or
yeah, oftentimes, yeah.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, and this is like part of the whole ritual for me, right? Is like
Yeah, yeah. You use the word ritual. I guess it is
it is
a literal
quite literally
ritual for you.
ritual work. I mean, I even tattoo my own characters, like on me.
That's
So,
hardcore. Hmm.
but it often starts with automatic drawing. So, it'll might be just a scribble on a page, but then you kind of sit with it for a little while, and it might start to look like something, and you kind of do that. I would sometimes do like noise divination, where you kind of like look at some static for a while and see what shapes you can find, stuff like
Hmm.
that. just kind of like trying to find new and interesting ways to kind of like, scratch away at the subconscious and see what bubbles up. And once you start to see, shapes and stuff like that, you put them together and just see what happens. I would say 90% of my work at this point is still improvisational.
Okay,
Um,
cool.
it's it's like playing jazz a little bit,
Yeah. Yeah, it
like
feels quite jazz-like now
following
you
the
say that.
flow. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
it feels like refined spontaneity.
Yes. And now that I've
You
got
can
like
steal
this,
that if you want to.
thank you, I will. And now that I've got like, all these like motifs and stuff like that I've worked with for a little over 2 years now, I can see things more readily in my sketches. And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, that's this character. Or, oh, that's, this idea that I want to refine a little bit. So,
I feel like
like,
that's really hard to take the sort of simple ideas that you have and really give them depth in life. That is I feel like a very unique skill that I so don't have. And I really admire in your work.
you could definitely do it. What I do is it's just practice. That's it.
Do you use any reference, like any reference material?
Sometimes like if oftentimes when I'm having to like draw something that like a horse, for instance, or I have a Sphinx character that I draw frequently. I gotta look up what a cat looks like every
Yeah.
time.
And a
uh,
horse, especially
like
a
and a
horse.
horse. I mean, and
Those
like
things aren't right.
no
As
matter how
when
much
I
I
got a
might
horse time.
distort the form, yeah, right. No matter how much I might distort the forms, I still have to kind of have for the pieces like that, the more figurative things that are based in real life. They need a little help.
And
So
one thing that I think really comes through in your work, which is digital, is that you have really rich textures
mm,
in your pieces, despite it also being quite like graphic. I feel like you really utilize texture in a way that really gives it depth and a sense of like tactility.
yeah, thank
Uh,
you.
how do you go about exactly like what is your technical process for achieving some of your textures?
Sure. If you've been following my work since the beginning, you'll see that like at the beginning, I was using a lot of scan textures. Like I would scan in pages from hymnals, I would scan in pages from the Bible. Like this is also part of this whole like deconstruction of spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
Using a lot of folded paper and stuff like that. Like I would just scan them in and start, collaging them as part of the piece, cutting up and all that stuff. That was a very different era of my work. And nowadays I've gotten much more into things like permacomputing, which we can go into in a second.
Yeah,
But
I'm not familiar with
oh, I
permacomputing.
would love to tell you about it. Okay, so but
Please do.
the short answer for that is that I've because now I'm working at much smaller resolutions, and the work is a lot grainier as a result. Like I'm just kind of leaning really hard into getting as much texture as I can out of a very small space. I think most of my work is like 1800 pixels square. Uh,
Okay. Yeah, to me that's still really like,
yeah,
especially coming from
it's not
doing.
Game Boy level, but
Yeah, I'm like, oh, that's like huge for
infinite
this.
canvas.
Yeah, not quite pixel art, but yeah, I think
Oh,
probably
like
for graphic
yeah,
design work that's small.
it's like just beyond pixel art, right? Like you
Hmm.
could still see the pixels, and if you zoom in onto literally any of my work from this year, you could see the pixels. Like it's very pixely when you get down to the level. But yeah, I've really tried to lean into how to get the most texture out of that, and it's a little tougher just plopping in scan stuff because it gets really muddy very fast.
So you're using
Uh,
sort of synthetic, like digital textures.
now I'm mostly using just a series of really customized brushes. Like I've
Hmm.
got like a nice like clumpy noise brush that I use for most of my shading. And I've got a couple rake brushes that I use a lot. You'll see like, really strong rake
Yes, yeah.
textures in there. Yeah.
I feel like the art of the digital paintbrush is so powerful and something that I don't know how to utilize at all because I'm not really that much of a digital artist. And
Mm.
I think when it's used really well, it can totally change a piece of
Oh,
digital art.
absolutely, absolutely. I would love to in this year start kind of getting messier again, and maybe exploring like maybe adding new colors. I mean, I've got a very defined palette, but like
Mm-hmm.
adding some new messiness and some new ways of like giving it more organic feel, like kind of bringing the physical back into it because I've been very digital for a long time.
Do you want to explain to me what permacomputing is?
Oh, permacomputing. Oh God. Okay, so I'm on Mastodon, for
Mm-hmm.
anyone who is over there, and I'm on a server called Mervi. It's run by some really cool people, and among them are Devine and Rekka from 100 Rabbits. They are an art collective that live on a boat up in the Pacific Northwest,
Okay.
and they're just really cool people. I've gotten to know them just a little bit, and
How big is this
they
boat?
it's just two people, and it's on like a
Okay.
real small sailboat. But they
Okay.
have programmed, like they are working on making an operating system called UXN, and it is targeted for old hardware. The overall idea is to create the I'm not a code person, I'm an art person, but like these people who are working on like perma computing solutions are people who are thinking about like the long term of like what does it look like when the internet is spotty? What does it look like when the internet is remote? And this is not just like a future hypothetical. This is like these people were traveling on sailboat, and they would hit, you go out in the Pacific, you're not getting the same signal that you'd get in the middle of Vancouver. Like it's a very different world, and you have to adjust your power usage, like working off of solar power,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. And so like they're developing software and whatnot that is targeted towards the oldest possible hardware they can, so they can continue to do their work for a long time. I'm kind of in on the shallow end of that, where I am intentionally purchasing hardware that is used, like not going out and buying the latest greatest thing. The
I say
brand
this as I
brand stuff.
nod using my brand new
Yeah, and
MacBook Air.
there's no shame in that. This isn't like a judgment session, right? Like I love some of the new stuff that's come out, but this is like a very intentional practice for me of like, well, like I'm very, that minimalist impulse of like, well, what can I get away with, right? And so like, right
what
now
what
I'm
can you do now with things, the limitations of the past?
right. So like I'm currently using a 2018 MacBook Air, not terribly old, but by MacBook Air standards, practically
Mm-hmm.
ancient. And I rolled it back to, oh, let's see. I'm giving this to every hacker out there, I'm sure. Uh
What's your IP
with my
address exactly?
but I'm using Mojave, which is like
Yeah, that's a little old.
several versions back. And the reason I chose that was so that I could run 32-bit programs as well as 64-bit ones.
Oh, okay,
Now,
that makes sense.
Adobe hates this. Adobe hates this because they want you
Adobe
to,
hates a lot of things.
Adobe hates everything,
Hmm.
everything good in the world.
Except your money. They love your money.
The nice thing is yeah, I'm paying for my Adobe subscription, but they can't force any more updates on me. I've got the last update that my computer could possibly handle. And because I'm working at such low specs and stuff like that, that has made that feasible. Like if I were trying to make these massive files and stuff like that with hundreds and hundreds of layers, it just wouldn't be feasible.
I think that's really interesting because it's kind of it's limited in kind of a gray space of where it's not long enough ago that there's any type of nostalgia or
Mm.
this like air of it's cool because it's old. It's like,
Right. No
oh,
one,
it's
no one
just like
is longing for the
old.
days of mid 20 teens
Yeah,
MacBooks. I mean, maybe someone
yet,
is, but
yet.
I am the one person who is like that was the golden era. Um,
Hmm. I'm
so
I'm working. I spent this weekend getting Mac Paint to work on my
Yes.
MacBook, which
Yes.
was
And I
the
loved your
original.
Mario Paint video.
Yeah, that was easy compared to just getting this to run on modern hardware. It
Mm.
was a challenge to just be able to use Mac Paint because it's a 38-year-old program.
Yeah.
And it was like the OG original image creation software, and everything else is based off of it. So I wanted to like go back to the beginning and like see what can be done with this absolutely bare bones first pass of this kind of software.
Yeah. And this ties back into computing as well, because you think about the all the software that has been lost to
Mm-hmm.
time, like the amount of effort you have to go through to run an old piece of software when we have computers that are exponentially so much more powerful. Like, why wouldn't they be able to, like, why couldn't we just emulate that, right?
Because then they can't still make money off of it, really. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's definitely one of the reasons.
Yeah, and I found, at least in the circles that I run in, it's a very permacomputing as a concept is very anti-capitalist in that it
Yeah,
is
it seems very anti-capitalist for
it's
sure.
thinking about the long term of a future where we may not have like the internet as we know it,
It's possible.
or yeah, or like it might be more locally based hubs or something like that. Like there's just it thinks about the possibilities, and it ties into things like solar punk and stuff like that, where people are looking to a smaller scale, decentralized, greener future.
Speaking of history and the past, what art movements would you point to that have been a large influence for you?
For me, almost any time period where abstraction has become like, the pendulum has swung back from realism and things like that towards abstraction is always been tops in my mind. Periods like that, like the medieval period, like I don't see that as like people lost the ability to draw. It was a time period where people were trying to express spiritual concepts and trying to express like a world that we can't just look out our window and see, right? Like they're not like,
That's
oh, I'll
very
draw this.
generous of you. That's very generous.
I mean, people were making very realistic art before that and after that. So I feel like it feels like, to me, this is just my personal theory, that it's more of an art, more of an artistic shift. Like their priorities were different culturally. Um, and I feel like we kind of see that again with like the rise of like modernism and like abstract art. And both of those periods to me kind of feel like they're both like early modern and abstract art. You've got artists like Hilma Af Klint. You've
Hmm.
got Malevich. These people were trying to express. They were associated with like theosophy and other occult groups. Um, Early modern art was an attempt to display or capture the spiritual realm as opposed to just what they could see. So
Right.
like it,
And sort of
it
like
seems
an
to be like this.
internal expression.
Yeah, it's like this recurring impulse in human history to like, it's okay, so we're looking outward, we draw what we see, and now we're looking inward, and we draw what we see, but what's inside, but we can't really reference that in any concrete way. So it just kind of comes out in these like colors and shapes and abstract forms. And I feel like I'm kind of working off of that lineage of like occultists and other people who were more concerned with like the spiritual rather than the physical.
Who are some of your favorite artists that are working right now?
Besides you.
Besides me, other than me. Yes.
Let's see. I adore Sophie Wake's art. She is a painter out of the UK, I believe. SophieWake.com. She does a lot of like angelic figures and birds. Is very much her jam. Adore her work.
Yeah, they're kind of like almost like a naivete, but or like folk
Yeah,
arty,
I feel
but
like I
in
see
a
some Matisse in there too.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And like
Like,
MC Escher, weirdly, with the sort of
yeah,
like repeated
she's
imagery.
doing some really cool stuff. I love that. I also love Pam Wishbow. They're an artist out of Seattle who's doing just absolutely fantastic, kind of like folk magic based stuff. You've
Are you
definitely seen
familiar
her.
with Death P Sun?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, I feel like I see some of those ties to some of your work of that sort of
I
the
could totally see. I was big into
magical.
juxtapose uh,
Hmm.
for a while. Buying the magazines and flipping through them. That was like what early mid 2000s. I was also super influenced by like Jonan Vasquez, who did like Invader Zim
Oh yeah, yeah.
and Johnny the Homicidal Maniac, stuff like that. Big into those comic scenes and animation scenes. That's foundational for me.
I'm curious as to what you think of the. I'm going to be careful in that I'm not insinuating that your work looks like this, but
Mm.
I feel like people who are working graphically and sort of a graphic illustration aesthetic were probably the source of inspiration for the corporate Memphis style. The like, I was curious as what your thought on like corporate Memphis or
I
the Google, the big tech art
Yeah,
style.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Okay, so I feel like I've got a pretty nuanced opinion of Corporate Memphis. I don't love it, but I understand its necessity. I have been doing graphic design and illustration for a long time, and I was doing specifically vector illustration for quite some time. So, that's how a lot of that stuff is made, right? Like it's all very like smooth shaped, plobby
Mm-hmm.
characters, that kind of thing. And it makes sense. Like if you're working under increased like shorter deadlines, smaller budgets, and bigger asks from your clients, of course you're going to gravitate to a style that you could just knock out, like you just spend as little time as possible on. And I know probably some people making this are going to be like, oh, how dare I work very hard to draw these cute little blobby people, and I get it,
It's
but
very efficient.
it's extremely efficient. And it portrays all that wonderful like friendliness that Facebook and Google and these big tech giants, they want you to feel like they give
Ooh,
like they
it's
care about you.
fun. It's
Yeah.
vaguely diverse, maybe. I don't
They're purple
know.
people for some reason.
Yeah.
They're orange and purple and all sorts of colors that people wouldn't be. So they can bypass diversity. Actually,
Yeah. Yeah.
trying to
It's
draw
like
people of
it's
color and stuff like that.
non-representation in the way that it represents
Yes.
nobody.
Yes, exactly. And like, I understand how like the labor conditions of the illustration industry have become a catalyst for corporate Memphis being the biggest thing around. And I think corporate Memphis feels like it's kind of on its way out, but I don't know
I
what it's
think
being replaced
they've caught
by.
on. They think
Yeah.
the art directors have been reading the comments.
I have found that because I was doing corporate Memphis stuff for a while for various corporate clients and stuff like that. Not under Helvetica Blanc, but under, just as getting by, working for companies, working in art departments, that kind of thing. And I noticed towards the end of my design career, if you will, they were going back to photography. At the end of the day, people, were like, okay, yeah, yeah, we'll do diversity. We'll bring in people, who aren't white, who aren't straight, things like that, and we'll do photographs. So that was the big push when I was last there, and I think that maybe that was my like, oh, okay, so if illustration has been pushed to its breaking point, um, might as well just start doing fine art.
Illustration feels like a very. I mean, I've done like some
Mm,
professional illustration, like editorial stuff, but
yeah,
not. But it's grueling and it's fast and
absolutely.
it's demanding
The turnaround times are wild.
and yeah, and you're really putting yourself you're not only putting yourself out there, but you're also supposed to be representing whoever you are doing the illustration
Yeah,
for
I mean,
as well.
these aren't your opinions, right? This is you're trying to convey the opinion of the guy who wrote the article that you don't really agree with, but you're like,
Yeah.
they're not saying anything awful. I just don't think it's great,
And
like,
then you're supposed to make gold out of it.
yeah, and then yeah, you have to just work with what you're given there.
I
Um,
think this actually is a great segue to what I wanted to talk about, because I know that we have similar views on, and that is AI art. Oh
oh my
no.
God.
Oh no. Um yeah, because I think we
God,
have
fuck
similar
AI art.
outlooks.
Can I say
And
that?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I made a fucking 25-minute video about it. So yeah, I don't think it's a surprise.
Yeah,
Um
not a shocker.
and I'm curious, is like, I feel like some corporations will use, it's like the it's like the corporate Memphis pipeline. It's like, this is now the way to further automate that. I don't know if that's
Absolutely.
and I have friends and people who have a very different opinion about AI art than I do.
Mm.
And I'm curious if your opinions are layered in that you think that there are good uses or the potential for good uses, or if it is like evil through and through and it needs to go.
Oh, sure. Okay. Here's my very nuanced opinion, which is
Mm-hmm.
I was using AI art for a minute. Like I thought
Mm-hmm.
back when it was mostly text based, and I know every poet out there is coming for my blood now. But like, I would take like Keats and Paradise Lost and select passages from the Bible and throw them in the blender and see what it shot out. In fact, my first zine, if you look at the Idolia series, is AI generated poetry that I have created illustrations to go with.
Yes.
And that was a very early experiment. That was a couple years ago at this point, right? And the technology wasn't there. It wasn't really it was a mess, and
Yeah,
and actually
it didn't look.
I thought that was kind of more interesting when AI art was just really spotty and like creating these kind of like uncanny, surreal like landscapes almost, like these
Yeah,
like
unidentifiable, but
yeah,
somehow in that uncanny valley of being close enough to something
it
that it
felt like more
conjures it.
collage. It felt like
Yeah.
collage work. I felt like I was looking at like what could have been a really interesting like neo dada kind of thing, right? Like where
Mm-hmm.
artists are putting out AI work that is just tackling social issues or whatnot. Uh, and it's somewhere along the way. I mean, probably from the beginning. Let's be real, because these things are funded by billionaires and tech giants and things like that who have a vested interest in reducing how much they pay for things like art. And somewhere along the way, they started scraping other illustrators' work to feed their training programs, and then it got better,
Weirdly, yeah.
mysteriously. And now you can say like, oh, give me so and so, but done in the style of Mike Mignola or whatever, and it spits out 50 copies of that, and you get to pick which one you think is the closest. Now, and like I could see hypothetically an illustrator that's maybe this just kind of feeds into the whole shorter and shorter turnarounds. Like, okay, hypothetically, an illustrator could sit down and go, okay, I'm gonna knock out 50 rough drafts, and they can pick one of these AI generated rough drafts, and then I can refine that. But it's never going to provide like the kind of um, interesting accidents and stuff.
It's like, and there's always people. I mean, I got literally 1,000 comments of people being like, oh, well, all artwork is derivative. All artists have just used past art to make
Yeah.
their art now. And this is no different. And you are going to be left behind if you think that this tool isn't.
Left behind from what though?
And I'm like, I already work in a medium that's dead. Like, what? I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, their idea is that like using AI generated images, at least as a way to like make new things is no different than people using inspiration from past work to make new things.
Yeah.
When I think
And
there is a clear difference in that.
absolutely. And what, and because like as many I could list, I have a whole page of influences on my website. If you go to the artwork section of my website, there is an influences section where you can click on a bunch of links to see artists and works that have influenced me. But even still, that's still being filtered through all of my experiences, my spirituality. It's coming from a very different place than a lot of these artists. So like it's sure we're influenced by other artists, but we're not just like, oh, I'm gonna, rip off this one artist today, or I'm gonna rip off this artist. It's that might be how we learn, but like it's never there's a big gap between learning from copying other artists and then going on to make something that is a unique and interesting synthesis of that filtered through your experience.
Yeah, I think that rebuttal and that response, it's so clear to me that those people are not artists. I've never
Oh,
heard an
absolutely.
artist say it's the same thing, because
Yeah.
anybody who's made art serious, you don't even have to be like a professional artist, but just
Yeah.
like have a love of making art, it's different. Like that
Yeah.
process
Yeah.
of coming from your own experiences and ideas is, it's not just like, okay, I'm gonna take the arm from Michelangelo, and then
Right,
it's like,
right. This is yeah, it's not weird science where you're you're like literally cut and pasting something together, and then yeah, the sum of the parts is so much less than
mm-hmm.
the parts themselves. And what happens when, in their hypothetical future, right, where like everybody gets on board with this? Who's making the source material that the AIs are training on? Or are we just going to be stuck with this, you know, history up until 2022 or 2024 when all artists started using AI instead? They have a really short-sighted interest.
There's even there's I've seen some I've attempted to read some academic papers kind of
Mm,
on this idea of that we are now transitioning into a post-human art movement, in the same way that we went
sure.
into like post-digital, and that
Gotcha.
like
Gotcha.
uh it now there is creation apart from human made things, um that is like now integrated or mainstream enough that it's like pervasive.
Yeah.
So now like there's going to be like a post-human movement, or this is part of the post-human movement
Right.
of just utilizing technology to create images outside of like human intervention. It's like neat in concept, and it's neat as like a theory, like as a insulated idea, but then
Sure.
you look
Damien
at
Hirst is going
like,
to go wild.
God, I honestly, I wouldn't be shocked if that dude has already like done a shit ton of AI art, because like,
I kind of feel like this stuff belongs to the conceptual artists, right? Like the ones who are like, it's about the process, and like my work is about the process too. But like they have absolutely no regard for what the end result is. Whereas I think the people who are making images very specifically and that are not commodities on the art market, they have a very different idea in mind about process.
do you think that it's here to stay, or do you think it is a fad that will dwindle in relevance, kind of like NFTs had?
I would say maybe well, it feels like the NFTs and AI art kind of go hand in hand, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Because well, I mean, the NFT people, their biggest stumbling block was that they had to hire artists to make their weird, cut and paste, swap out art, right? Like it was all very
They're
samey.
DeviantArt adoptables.
Yeah, DeviantArt adoptables, exactly. And so it was like, oh, this one has a party hat. Oh, this one's got a military uniform. This one's carrying a nuclear warhead. But it was all like the same cut and paste thing, right? And I feel like AI art just feels like it belongs with that. And it's like, oh, you can just automate that shit. Now you don't even need to pay an artist. If we can successfully funnel it into just those folks, yeah, it'll go the way of the buffalo with that. But I think the idea of people interacting with computing for their art is going to be something that will be around as long as there are computers. Um,
Totally.
People are going to find new and interesting ways to work with it. And I think there's still like if we can get away from like for instance, if I were to use an AI and train it on my own work, right, which I wouldn't want to do, but if I were to create the training set myself and set it loose as part of an experimental set of pieces, could find some really interesting stuff there, especially if I then reincorporate it and go, okay, well, I like this, but I'm going to change some things. I'm going to make this more clear or less clear, like take an artistic eye to it instead of just, well, that's what the computer gave me, so that's what I've got. I think there's
Yeah, I think
still
there's a nugget of something interesting there.
Yeah, and possibly one day we can go back to it being a niche hobby thing where you know people are training it on their own doodles or whatnot, and you can kind of get some interesting fun experiments out of it. But as long as it's being pushed as this is fundamentally a labor issue, as a way to undercut illustrators, I can't stand by that,
Do you
like.
have you seen any effect in your sphere of that, or do you think that it hasn't
Well,
really?
not for me in particular, just because I've mostly transitioned out of graphic design and illustration, like commercially. I know that there's we've already seen what one or two covers for like the New Yorker or magazines
Mhm.
like that have utilized AI art. I feel like we're going to see more and more of that. I think that's just kind of the stage of late capitalism that we're in, right? Where no matter how much people are going to push back against it and say it sucks, that's just more views for their article, about how great it is. Um,
I've also seen it being integrated into internet ads. Like that's
yeah.
I have
Oh,
like started
absolutely.
seeing it just like in the wild. It's not
Absolutely.
about AI art or
It
anything.
might
They're
end
just
up
like,
being the new corporate Memphis, right? Is like these kind of weird, janky things because at the end of the day, a lot of these people making this imagery or the ones in charge of making the imagery, not the artists themselves, don't care that much. They aren't that particular if a person has 6 or 7 fingers on their hand or if things are a little off feeling. Like they just want an image that will get people to click the button so that like they can sell their product or their service or whatnot. Sell you a subscription for a mobile game or
yeah, they
something.
bank on you not paying attention
Yeah,
enough.
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I mean, like as far as we might see some interesting use cases in art in like the fine art world, but I think largely it's going to have a net negative effect on illustrators going forward.
The scary part is that like this has backing by
Mm,
the investment by like
absolutely.
mega corporations that are influencing the way that we work now, like
Yeah,
Adobe and Microsoft. And
absolutely.
so that's the part where I'm like, oh, it's not just like some weird
Yeah,
NFT
this isn't
crypto
coming
shit.
from out of nowhere, right? Like this is something that's been building for the decades at this point, where they're just, I mean, and of all the things to try to automate from the human experience, art. We couldn't automate the difficult work that maims and kills people, but we can automate the one of the few things that brings joy, for just the sake of doing it.
Yeah, that's where I
There's
can't
something very
quite
soulless
figure
there.
out the angle. I'm like, what is this fucking end game? Like, what is? It
I
doesn't add
think it's
up to
because
me.
the people who are invested in it, they see tech as a solution to everything.
Mm.
I mean, I know I've had this experience working in design, making websites and stuff like that, right? Where the business people, the people who care about, oh, does the money go up? Is the money happy? They aren't terribly interested about like the art or the craft behind it. They just want the money to be happy. They just want that line to go up, right? And as long
Money
as that
happy.
happens, the money's happy, and you got to keep the money together in a big hoard, otherwise it gets sad. If it's in poor people's pockets, it's sad.
Can't have that. That'd be terrible. The money
It's
doesn't
all
want to be
alone.
there. Not to this is there's no transition to this, but you touched on it briefly. But sort of to close out the conversation, I wanted to ask you, I guess, more directly, like, how do you think your queerness and your identity has influenced your art making or your experience as an artist, or hasn't it, or what is that
It
relationship?
it definitely has. I mean, like as I think I mentioned before, there's this very long deconstructive process, right, of deconstructing my religion and deconstructing my gender and sexuality were a big part of that. If you look at my work now, I don't get very explicit with it, but a lot of my work, very few of the characters have gender. Most of them are kind of these genderless blobs. And when I do name them, like for instance, Ayan or Ikari or things like that, they're usually using they pronouns. And this is, a lot of this is exploration of my own interior world, where, you know, gender is in flux.
Mm-hmm.
And very often gender doesn't even figure into the equation when building a persona. So yeah, I think that's probably the biggest way it's affected it. I know that like there's there's definitely like a lot of like stuff like packaged up when I'm deconstructing like religious trauma or like working with like that frame of time where like as a kid who was queer but didn't really have the vocabulary for that, like how would that come out, how would that be expressed, and like digging into that for more inspiration for my own work. It sometimes like raises itself to the surface, but it's not often very explicit. Like I don't really have a lot of like, oh, like here's the trans flag or whatever, right, kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But like the queerness is inherent to the work, because it's being made by a queer person about their own subconscious. Uh, so yeah, it's there. It's just not always waving a flag or anything.
Yeah, and I think that's there's not a right or wrong way to necessarily go about that
Right,
either. And I
right,
think
absolutely.
everyone just brings their own level of overtness or opaqueness they
Hmm,
want to express
absolutely,
that stuff like visually.
absolutely. I made a joke one time. I said that the only like one of the reasons I'm trans is because I only ever draw eyes and hands. And
Mm-hmm.
there's just something about like in my experience of being trans, like that like disembodiedness, right? Of like eyes and hands are all that really matter, you know. Which could speak to all sorts of things, right? Like feeling like you're not connected to your own body, trying to bring those things in line, stuff like that. But it was like this, it was like a little goof I made on Twitter one point, and like so many people responded were like, "Holy shit, you're right."
I mean, I think, yeah, it is. I think it's right. And this is, I think, part of the conversation I was having with Zoe as well is I feel like a lot of queer people and trans people, especially when they're making art, there is this sort of like morphing subversion dissociated thing around the body because being trans is experiencing transness is very body oriented when you
Yeah,
are
yeah,
going through the world.
absolutely, absolutely. Either people are like making all sorts of assumptions about your body, or you're having to present a certain way to like be safe, in many circumstances. Like there's just so many ways in which like your body is open to more scrutiny, I think,
Mm-hmm.
than like people who don't experience that. So yeah, yeah, like it was a very funny observation, but like eyes and hands, that was kind of the the giveaway. I should have known I was trans.
I do, yeah, I do see it though. Like there is, it's kind of hard to exactly put your finger on, but there is kind of a similar shared thing that goes
There's
on
a
with
gestalt there. Look
that.
at all these hands in your background.
I know what I have a collection of hands.
You're gonna be
Yeah,
you're gonna be you're
it's
gonna be thinking about this one for a minute.
yeah, I don't know what that's about. I wanted to know also like has it impacted the way people perceive or digest your work? Like, has there been any sort of response from the outside in regarding identity or queerness? Or do you think that that's not something that is necessarily important to you to overtly portray, so that there's that doesn't necessarily bleed
You
in?
know, it's really interesting. A lot of the responses that I get to my work are people saying that like they have an emotional response to it, but they're not really sure what that emotion is. And like I feel like that tells me that I'm kind of on the right path, right? Is that I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, so I'm evoking something common with someone else, but like we don't really have a name for it. And like, gosh, if there's not any more apt thing for like mysticism and spirituality, right? Like, how do we even begin to put a name or a label on these things? But like, I found that like I pay attention to who follows me or comments or likes stuff like that. We're all looking at our social media, right? And it's like almost everybody in my audience is queer in some
Mm-hmm.
capacity. Like there are very, very, very few people that are not intersecting with queerness that follow and appreciate my work.
It's interesting
If
how
you're
that
out there, please
happens.
tell me what you see. Uh, like, but like,
Give it a couple years.
yeah, queer people. Yeah.
Mm.
Are you about to find? You're about to have a very difficult discussion with yourself.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but uh, but yeah, it seems like because my work resonates so deeply with other queer people, that there's something there that's inherently queer about it, in my expression that maybe I'm not even aware of yet. But I find it interesting nonetheless.
So as we've been talking for a hot minute. As we close out this conversation, what are you working on right now?
Oh gosh. Okay, so I am working on an oracle card deck. So if you're familiar with tarot, there's like 1,000 ways to do divination card decks. And I am working on my own. I plan to do a tarot deck at some point, but right now we're starting with the oracle one because
I feel like that makes perfect sense for you. That seems like the
like
natural
of course I'm
thing
going to
for
do
you to do.
my
Yeah,
own
yeah.
weird thing. Yeah, yeah. So I'm working on an oracle card deck and I am sharing the progress on my Patreon, which is patreon.com/Helvetica Blanc. You can also find my work at helveticablanc.com, which has links to everything and also in a full archive of my art, so you can see everything. But I'm sharing the progress every week over on Patreon. And I also put up sketches, which will eventually become new full pieces. So you kind of get first looks at what my brain is doing these days.
Yeah, your Patreon's very timely and
Yeah,
consistent.
thank you. It's part of the
In which
ritual every
my
Friday.
it yeah, in mine, I'm like, I get your emails because I'm one of your patrons, and
Yeah.
I'm like, I should be better.
Let my emails be a reminder to update
Yeah,
your Patreon. Absolutely.
yeah.
You just have to like make it your spiritual practice. That's the trick, really. You just
Yeah,
yeah.
first I need to like gain spirituality first. I think that's where I'm at, is I need to start from that, and then I can sort of work it into my art
Absolutely. Yeah.
practice.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you go for this evening. Thank you so much for talking with me. It was lovely to talk to you. I haven't seen your
It's
face
so good to
in like
see you.
2 years.
It's been so long.
We should definitely talk more consistently, which is a thing that I'm trying to do across the board because I have a tendency to not.
Yeah, 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 that'd be fantastic.
All right. No, that's the cut.
Cut.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you so much for listening or watching. Again, if you'd like to support the podcast or any of the weird endeavors I do, you can go over to my Patreon at patreon.com/catgrapham, and you can follow this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere you get podcasts, wherever they're grown these days. Until next time, do an art. Just some